Welcome to today's keynote session of the 2022 Ingenium Professional Development Seminars with lunch sponsored by Friends of Engineering. On behalf of Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba, I am Mike Gregoire, Director of Professional Standards, and I will be the moderator for today's keynote. Throughout today's presentation, we encourage you to send in any questions you may have for the presenter via the chat. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and will be available through the Ingenium Hub until January. This session has been designed to encourage a conversation between the presenter and the audience. After a brief slideshow, we will be opening it up to questions from attendees. It is now my great pleasure to welcome our presenter for this keynote session on the topic of regulatory reform, Richard Steinecke. Richard, you can now share your screen and it's over to you.
Thank you so much. Regulatory reform has been a big development for regulators across Canada. And I want to look at what some of these reforms are and why they're happening, and I hope we have a good discussion about it afterwards. Now, there are four essential concepts I'd like to talk about in terms of how professional regulation is evolving. The first is the public interest. The second is governance. Then we talk a little bit about how risk management principles come into professional regulation. And then I want to look at performance reviews for regulators. So beginning with the public interest, there has been some discussion, a lot of discussion and some evolution on how you would define the public interest that's served by regulators of professions. And there are four basic concepts. And the first concept is that you are primarily there as a regulator to prevent harm. You're there to prevent harm by registrants, members of the profession, against clients and other members of the public. And in these harms, health and safety, of course, is paramount, but there are other kinds of harms that are also important to look at, including emotional, psychological, environmental, financial. So how do you achieve this? How do you reduce harm? How do you address harm? And primarily, regulators do this through the activities that they engage in. Those include ensuring that the people entering the profession are competent and professional or ethical, that there are standards of or expectations, standards of practice, and that there is some way of ensuring that registrants comply with those expectations. Now, having said that, regulators are increasingly being called in to look at how they can participate in some of the broader issues of society. And so there are societal issues such as climate change and human rights, equity, diversity, inclusion, that regulators are being asked to participate in. And so it is a bit of a challenge defining or describing when regulators do that and when they leave it to others. And then the fourth component of the public interest is kind of a negative one. It is that there are certain things that are hands off of regulators. You need to stay away from becoming a member service organization. And that's difficult, and we may discuss that later, but that is a challenging thing to identify what really is primarily in the public interest and what might not be in the public interest, even though public interest language is being used. So once we get into past the public interest, then we start looking at, well, how should regulators be governed? And so governance is a word that's being tossed around a lot. And what are people talking about when they talk about governance for regulators? And I would say that there's sort of four aspects to that. One aspect is how a regulator sets its priorities, how it establishes a strategic plan, what it emphasizes, what it's going to be focusing on, and how those decisions are made. Secondly, how the people who are involved in the organization, the council or the board of directors, the senior staff, the committees, how they are chosen, and on what basis they are chosen, by what criteria and who chooses them. The third component is ensuring that those who are involved in regulation fulfill their fiduciary duties. And this would include things like avoiding conflicts of interest and respecting confidentiality. And then the fourth point, part of governance, is figuring out who's going to do what. Because if you have people competing to do the same things within the organization, tripping over each other's feet, that's not going to help. And if you have people that are not choosing to do something and something nobody takes responsibility for a major decision, then that's also a problem. Now, you folks are particularly knowledgeable about risk management, and indeed the risk management concepts that are talked about so much today draw a large part from professional engineering. But the process, this simplified process, is sometimes a little bit more challenging to apply in the regulatory context. So the first part, of course, is to figure out what are the priorities, what are the risks that we need to address. And so let's just take one example. Let's say that professional geoscientists doing resource visits in remote areas causes challenges, anxieties for women and perhaps people with less traditional expressions of gender identity. And they might avoid going into the profession at all, or going into certain parts of the profession because that's expected. And then you would analyze the risks. Well, how many people are affected by this? What's the impact? Are they leaving the profession? Are they choosing other parts of the profession to be part of? What are the biggest factors in causing that? And what are the current measures in place to try to address that issue? And then the regulator might say, okay, we need to figure out how to address that risk. What are some standards or expectations we could set out? What are some communications we could convey? How could we engage with employers who are not part of who we regulate on this? Could we perhaps include in our discussions others such as human rights commissions? And then after you've developed your plan, you then want to monitor and review it. Are the measures we are taking making a change? Are more women entering the profession or this part of the profession? So that's an example, but that's an example more that's profession orientated. Really, risk-based regulation is when you look at harms to the public. You're saying, okay, what are the harms that affect the public? You know, let's do some research, let's do some surveys, focus groups. Perhaps we could get a public advisory committee that we could have a good discussion with. We should look at our complaints data and understand what are the harms that our registrants are causing the public. And I'm not sure what that would be for you. Maybe, obviously, could be engineering failures, buildings falling down, or airplanes falling out of the sky. It could be illnesses through airborne diseases that aren't adequately prevented in indoor spaces. It could be environmental damage, such as that school in the US we heard about that was on radiation contaminated soil. So you figure out what those harms are, and then you look at what are the things that we as a regulator can do to address those harms. So can we provide education? Could we include professional development? Could we set some standards? Could we do some inspections or quality assurance activities? Could we take this into account when doing when dealing with complaints? So this slide and the next one is from the Human Resources Professional Association of Ontario, the Regulators for Human Resources Professionals. And they did some amazing work. They put on one single slide the most significant, because of their severity or frequency, potential harms caused by their registrants. And so it would be amazing for regulators to be able to have a one-slide list of the major harms, and that could focus their activity. And then there's also some work that's beginning to be done on profiling the at-risk practitioners. And this is a graph chart from my profession in Ontario. And they discovered that sole practitioners are less than 1/3 of the profession, but they are almost 80% of the cases that go to discipline. And so those are the most at-risk practitioners. And so our regulator has done a lot of work to try to engage sole practitioners to change those numbers. The last thing I want to look at is measurement and accountability. You are already being held accountable. And so everyone at the association should also be evaluated. I suspect quite strongly that your staff are evaluated. But what about your council members, the committees, the committee members? How about the performance of the association itself in achieving its goals? Are they adequately measured and evaluated? And there is a lot of work being done in this area. One of the most challenging is, how do you evaluate the performance of individual council members? So the dental regulator in Ontario developed a sort of a first step in which all of the members of the council, some 20-odd members of council, evaluated every other member of council on a whole bunch of criteria as to how they were doing. And what was made public was the collective scores. And so on one issue, on one of the measures that you were scored on is, does this individual make a valuable contribution to the functioning of the council? And so there were 17 identity, it could be one person, it could be 2 or 3 people, but there were 17 counts of someone who only made 1 out of 10 on a score of contribution to the council. And so the collective score was 7.28, the median or average score. Now, on another measure, do they demonstrate and understand their fiduciary duties in the role of the regulator? The score is quite different. The average score was 8.96, and there was very few low scores and quite a few high scores. So this was measured. Now, you also were required under this measurement scheme to identify your own performance as a council member, and then you were given privately, confidentially, how you were scored by everyone else on the council, the collective scores for you. And so you could compare how your colleagues, your peers, rated you in each of these areas. And so that's, a good first step in the area. There's also ways of measuring accountability and performance of a regulator itself. And so in Ontario, all the health professions have been required to complete a very detailed report of their performance with a lot of very specific criteria. So for example, on governance, they would say, what do you do to recruit members to council and committees? What are your training? Do you have a conflict of interest policy? And do you have a register of the affiliations of every member of the council? And so, and then you have to publish your report. Of course, that's a self-report. There is increasing expectations that you would also have an external person evaluate whether you were meeting these performance goals. So the point of all this is to say that a lot of change is coming, and you need to, as a regulator and as a profession, say, are we going to start working in these areas to, well, I shouldn't say start, should you further work in these areas to enhance your performance, or are you going to be dragged kicking and screaming when, like last week in British Columbia, they tabled a 300-page bill with detailed expectations and requirements for the health professions, including 650 sections in the statute. Do you want to be hit by a Mack truck when that drops in your province? So that's the sort of introductory overview, Mike. And so I think we are going to have a bit of discussion now.
Richard, thank you very much for your presentation. Some really big topics that you've put forward today. Some evolving areas such as expectations for regulators to perform risk assessments and choose their direction based on this assessment. I really hope that we can get some questions from the audience, those who are attending today. I know that I have some questions as well, and we might start off with those. But for anybody who's attending, and if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please type them in the chat and I will read them out for Richard. I'll start with one, Richard. It's this idea of the word registrant. I heard you use that quite a few times in this presentation. I've heard it at a lot of professional development seminars for regulators. Why is that term being used instead of member?
Yeah, language sends a message, and the word member, even if it's in your legislation, and still in the legislation of most professions, makes it sound like you're a club. And you're there to assist and support each other. And so the word registrant makes it clear that practitioners, their status is someone who's being regulated by the organization, and that the organization's role is to regulate you. And it's also important that using the word member in some context can convey some unfairness. So for example, if a complaint comes in and you're writing a decision saying the complainant says this and the member says that, the contrasting those two terms right beside each other makes it really sound unfair. And so that's why there's a lot of movement towards using words like registrant or even licensee rather than member.
Have you seen any regulators that have evolved their legislation in that regard then to move away from the term member and into something like licensee or registrant?
For sure. I mean, it's still early stages, but that bill introduced in Bill 36, introduced in British Columbia, they moved to that. So they're not using member anymore.
Interesting. I also heard you talk about the term public interest during your presentation. That's a term we see throughout our own act. It's something that we talk about and we take to heart, that it's the public interest that we need to protect, and that's our main mandate. How have you seen that evolve over time, this idea of public interest?
Yes, it really has evolved over time. At the beginning of my career, most regulators were focusing on registration and complaints and discipline, and that was what regulators were about. So some decades ago, more and more regulators were saying we need to move beyond that to look at quality assurance or quality improvement, and not just CPD, but inspections, assessments, peer assessments, practice assessments. And so that's become increasingly common. Transparency has also become common in terms of being more open about what you do as a regulator and providing more information about practitioners. And if we have time, we might talk about that later. There's been quite a push, in the last couple of decades to be fair in terms of the mobility of international practitioners, to recognize their competencies without, just confining them to a piece of paper that's only commonly found in North America, and ensuring the mobility of registrants across Canada. Telepractice has certainly become common for many professions, and some rules have started to develop there. In the last few years, cultural sensitivity and cultural humility, especially in terms of Indigenous peoples and truth and reconciliation, and equity, diversity, inclusion has become a prominent issue. And we're really in the early days there. We're just sort of gathering data, but in the United Kingdom, they've been doing a lot of work on this. And they have said, first of all, you need to know whether you're being proportionate in terms of complaints, in terms of discipline, in terms of access to the profession, so that your profession and your processes are proportionate to the relative percentage of people in the profession. And also you need to interact with schools and employers so as to try to discourage disproportionate complaints based on, for example, the racialized basis of practitioners. Climate change and environment has really started to come in, and certainly British Columbia has explicitly included that in the legislation overseeing professional engineers and geoscientists. We've also, we were talking before the session about wellness. Regulators have become involved in that. Just before the pandemic, people would say, some commentators would say, that's not really the role of a regulator, but I think now that's being accepted. And we're even seeing some progress, some thoughts that regulators should be involved in emergency preparedness and workforce planning for shortages that might occur. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, it's fascinating. Yeah, I'm glad that you touched on the sort of equity and diversity component. I didn't know that in the UK that was being imposed on the regulators. So that's very interesting to find out. And that BC has, you're saying it's implemented climate change actions or some kind of activities around that within their legislation. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I've heard the term separation of functions trend, and sort of the idea of an association of members versus a regulator of registrants. Can you tell us a bit more about that separation of functions trend and what you've seen in that regard?
Yeah, it's confusing both to the profession and to the public when a regulator also provides membership support services, things like insurance, job postings, and perhaps even, awards. And so a number of provinces, Ontario for quite a while, BC, and more recently in Alberta, have become strict on this, saying that if you're a regulator of a profession, you need to very carefully look at your activities and say, is this really about protecting the public, or is this providing a membership service primarily, even though it has some spillover into protecting the public, and to separate those functions out. Now it gets much more difficult to do this with smaller numbers. We were at a conference in PEI for regulators, and I was talking to some professions. They have like 100 members. How do you have two organizations supported by 100 members? And so it is a challenge in some circumstances. And it's also difficult to be definitive, as I just was saying about wellness. Like, is that part of the mandate of a regulator to try to promote wellness within the profession? And so there's a lot of debate about that, and there's a push to do this. And so I think that is a trend that's coming really to all of the provinces in Canada.
Yeah, we do have a question in the chat. I'll get to that in a sec. I just want to sort of follow up on that topic, separation of trends. I know that the College of Registered Nurses of Manitoba went through that recently. It was just within the last few years where they were mandated to separate those functions out. Tell me, I mean, you're a lawyer, and do I understand right that that law societies set fees, or is that a different group that sets fees for lawyers?
Well, I think the most legal regulators in Canada have moved away from that, if they ever were involved. Certainly in my province, they do not set fees. That is something that's done by, well, first of all, it's not really done that much at all, but to the extent it is done, it's done by the Bar Association. They might have a suggested fee schedule. Right. So that's something that regulators do not get involved in. What regulators get involved in is if fees are misleading, or if there's an aggressive collection approach. That's something that regulators might get involved in, but not in setting fees.
Yeah, the reason I ask it is it's a topic that sort of reappears once in a while for our associations. People are asking, well, should we be setting fees? Right now, we do have the Consulting Association that does set those fees, and we help to publish them. But yeah, it's a topic that gets raised quite regularly at our association. I do have a comment and some questions here in our chat. This is from Lisa. Lisa says, thank you for the presentation. Due to the language used to date, many have the understanding that equity and representation in the professions should be left solely to advocacy bodies, for example, girls in STEM organizations. But as you mentioned in your example, negligent, ignorant, or even predatory behaviors that are tolerated speak to our collective and individual professionalism and have real outcomes on who is included, excluded, and harmed. Can you please further speak to the role of regulators in issues of equity? What can the role of the regulator be expanded to on this front?
Okay, great question. And I think that there has been an evolution of thinking here that When you get into things like recruiting students in high school and university to join a profession, that could easily be seen as a professional self-interest activity. And so it's the type of activity that's partly an issue. But in more recent times, there's been a sense that there is systemic discrimination along a lot of fronts, and that all institutions, including regulators, are caught up in that. And so all institutions, including regulators, need to carefully review what they do to see if they can address the problem. And so first of all, it's looking internally, are our practices discriminatory? The way we hire people, are people whose names suggest that they are not English or not European in origin? Are they more frequently the subject of complaints? Are they more frequently sent to discipline? Do they get more severe sentences on average? And if so, why does that happen? And so there's that. And then there's sort of the professionalism piece, that discrimination by the people that you regulate is a fundamental violation of the values of our society. And so that should be professional misconduct. And it is professional misconduct. There's no doubt about that. I don't think that it's ever been said that's okay, but there's a lot more sensitivity about that. And then there's the kind of discrimination that is not obvious. For example, in Ontario, the government imposed a requirement that to become a certified teacher, you had to pass a math exam. And there was some research done that showed that racialized people were much more likely to fail the math exam than not racialized people. And there was a lot of reasons for why that occurred, and that the exam was basically discriminatory. And there was also evidence that in order to achieve better math scores, which was the goal of this math proficiency test, there were other methods, such as having a course on mathematics as a prerequisite to becoming a teacher, and that there was a benefit of having racialized teachers teaching math to students, so that that would enhance the math proficiency of racialized students. And so that rule was struck down. So there's a lot of stuff that regulators can and must be doing, and it's going to increase. We're just at the early stages. And I think one of the first steps is getting proper data.
That's great. Thank you. And thank you, Lisa, for your question. Another question that gets raised quite regularly, we get this from members who are registered in multiple provinces. Somebody's a member in Alberta, they're a member in Saskatchewan, they're a member in Manitoba, and they've asked the question, well, why can't I just register once? Why can't I register with a national regulator and pay one set of dues and be done with it? It would be a lot more simple for me as a professional. So talk to us about the idea of a national regulator of our professions.
Yeah, there's a lot of policy reasons why that would be a great idea. Of course, there always are some issues as to whether there would be a dominance by one part of the country over the other. First of all, it's now been clarified by the Supreme Court of Canada that a national regulator, properly structured, is legal in our Constitution. So there's not a legal barrier. And in fact, in Australia, which has a similar sort of constitutional framework to Canada, it has been done for the health professions. Now, it was a minor miracle. It was a constellation of a whole bunch of scandals and other things that led to it, but it can be done. But it's politically really, really difficult. And so I think it's going to be very hard for this to happen for any profession. However, certainly there are intermediate steps that can be taken that could at least get us part of the way there. So we already have the Canadian Free Trade Agreement that's promoting easier mobility across Canada. Regulators across Canada are almost all collaborating together to try to ensure that they have common approaches to standards of practice and various regulatory activities. And I think that it's going to be difficult, but I think what you're going to see is there's probably going to be a national register or registry of all of the members of one profession across Canada, so that there's a central access point for you to find out about anybody. And I think one of the first professions that might do this is nursing. They seem to be doing some hard work on this. I think it's hard to do. It's going to take a while, but that I think is foreseeable perhaps in our lifetimes.
That's fascinating. I hadn't heard about that example from Australia, and that's I guess you could say it's encouraging to know that that is a possibility. But I agree that politically it's a long ways away. The idea of a national register is one that we've discussed with our counterparts across Canada for engineering and geoscience. One of the issues that gets raised by certain provinces is that they're concerned about the privacy aspect, about this sharing of information, and that they're not allowed to share information outside of their provincial boundaries due to their privacy legislation. Have you heard anything about that argument? Or?
Oh yes, I've heard that argument. I think most privacy legislation, though, would have an exemption for regulatory purposes. And they certainly would have an exemption for publicly available information. So if the information is already publicly available on your provincial or territorial register, then there's no real barrier to allowing it to be put on a register that includes other provinces and territories. And to the extent that there might be some outlier legislation, I'm sure that could be amended. But I think even under existing legislation, it likely can be done now.
Yeah, I like the idea of a national register. Just even for the individual registrant to have one number that they have to remember. This is my number, and they can use it all across the country. It also helps when we're communicating, right? So somebody wants to get registered in another province, we have to make sure, are we talking about the same person here? Well, sure, it's the same name, but is it the same person? So that would be a good outcome for well, certainly for our professions, but I would say all professions in general. Talk to us about the regulation of practices versus individual practitioners. This is something that I don't really know much about personally, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Okay. This might be a longer term in the future kind of thing, but there seems to be a disconnect between a regulatory scheme where only individuals within one profession are regulated by a specific body, when in fact, in many areas of activity, you are collaborating or you're working on a team. So there's some thought, why should one person on the team be held accountable for what the team decides because their regulator has received a complaint or their regulator is looking into it, and the regulator of others or those who are unregulated on the team escape scrutiny? It just doesn't seem appropriate. And the power of a regulator to change the behavior of a team when they can only regulate one person on the team is also a problem in terms of effectiveness. So there's been some discussion about, well, should activities or perhaps work settings be regulated rather than individual practitioners? And so you could see, for example, saying, for hospitals, why don't we regulate hospitals rather than all the individual practitioners within the hospitals and not having a say over the unregistered people within the hospital? If you want to change behavior in a hospital, why not regulate them, the activity as a whole? But then that leaves, what are you going to do about the people, the members of the profession, the registrants who don't work in the hospital? It involves a huge paradigm shift. So for example, if you're going to be regulating real estate transactions, you're going to be regulating the realtor, the mortgage broker, the lender, the lawyer, and all of them have their own regulatory bodies. And so that's going to be difficult to achieve. So I suspect that what we're going to see is an incremental shift where it makes sense, where you might, where, for example, regulators of people who generally work on the same kind of team, they might collaborate more closely together so that there's coordinated regulation when there is an issue or a concern.
That's fascinating. I know that there's certainly been movement sort of in that direction within BC and Alberta. I've been talking to my counterparts there, where they do audits of firms, and they're really looking at this idea of we have to create an environment for our practitioners that encourages success. And so that means making sure that they have access to professional development opportunities, or to have access to all the technical standards and guidelines that they need to do their job well. And so this kind of takes it to the next level, which is, okay, well, there's not just engineers in that firm. Who else is in that firm? And are they all working together towards creating the best outcome and protecting the public in the best way possible? We certainly have technologists right now are separate. They're a separately regulated group. And then we're seeing more in terms of professional biologists. So BC has a professional biologist association. So I can imagine in a firm that offers environmental services, you're going to have people from various regulatory bodies, like you say, but they're all operating under one company, providing one service on one project. So that's a very fascinating concept. I just want to sort of give a little plug and encourage people to put questions into the chat. Maybe you're all too busy eating that delicious lunch that Friends of Engineering has provided to us. I'm looking forward to having mine when we're done here, Richard. But again, if anybody does have a question, if there's anything that we bring up that causes you to wonder something more in detail, even if it's something we discussed previously, please feel free to put it in the chat. Oh, and one has just popped up. This is a question from Kavanaugh. The concept of risk-based regulation is interesting. Could this mean additional requirements for high-risk registrants, such as sole practitioners versus low-risk registrants?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, it could. Regulators are really hesitant to do that. So most of the work I've been seeing is doing things like making resources available to solo practitioners, establishing a mentoring program for solo practitioners. I have seen in our profession, you're more likely to receive a practice visit or a practice audit if you're a solo practitioner than if you are a member of a large firm. So I think it's fair to say that you could receive additional scrutiny. But regulators are hesitant to impose higher burdens. The statistics, and it's not, I showed you statistics from law, but that's across all the professions that I've seen, that those who work in a solo office or even in a rural setting are much more likely to face issues. And so I think it needs to be recognized. It needs to be, people need to be candid about it and say, this is an issue, and how can we, using right touch regulation principles, not posing an undue burden, protect the public from higher risk practitioners?
Yeah, again, having talked to my counterparts in BC and Alberta, they're applying that same principle, which is that it's not that we're going to impose extra conditions on them, but they are more likely to have an audit performed if they're a small or sole practitioner setup versus some of the larger firms where they have the opportunity for peer review, for example, which obviously catches more errors and reduces the risk to the public. You just used a term there that I've been hearing more of lately, right touch regulation. Maybe you could tell us what that means. What does right touch regulation mean? And should we be prepared for that?
Yeah, right touch regulation is a term that was coined by the Professional Standards Authority in the United Kingdom. And basically the concept is that we need to be flexible in the regulatory tools that we use when we identify a risk. And you shouldn't say, well, we've identified a problem here and we're going to deal with it through complaints and discipline. There are lots of tools short of complaints and discipline that can change behavior. And so I think you're seeing a lot more attempt to use educational measures to publish standards and guidelines, and to engage in continuing professional development in specified areas. to try to address risks rather than just saying we're going to really whack you if we catch you. In my profession, we're not very advanced when it comes to quality improvement, but we do have continuing professional development requirements that we have to have, certain amount of hours in practice management or practice issues as opposed to substantive law. We also have to have some time in equity, diversity, inclusion training to educate us and to facilitate better practice in that area, rather than trying to make it a new definition of professional misconduct in terms of practice skills. You can imagine in our profession that, especially the history that we've had in terms of laws relating to Indigenous peoples, that's been a huge issue that law societies have been encouraging and indeed requiring lawyers to become educated in because of what we've done in the past.
Right. Yeah, I've been seeing that in the engineering profession as well. Some provinces, they have a bank of professional development activities that they've created, and there's a requirement in the overall professional development program to take a certain amount of that bank, or to learn things. And it's same kind of topics that you're talking about here in terms of equity and diversion, and making sure that that we all understand some of the mistakes we've made in the past, and to work towards improving ourselves as a profession. Talk to me about, or talk to us, I guess, about governance reform proposals. I know we've seen in some provinces where the way that a board is structured is changing, where we're having more involvement by non-members or non-registrants on the board, for example, or qualifications-based selection. Can you tell us a little bit about governance reform proposals that are happening?
Yeah, this has been, it's been a while now that this has been discussed and debated by regulators and governments across Canada. And this is another import from the United Kingdom and to a lesser extent, Australia. So there's a few concepts here that are quite important. The first is that the selection of a board or council members, I equate those two terms, your council members, your board, your directors, that they should be selected on a competency basis, they should not be elected by the profession. And that this is more likely to have the kinds of people on your council that are comfortable and knowledgeable and skilled in professional regulation. And along with that is the proposal that at least 50% of your board or council should be public members. And they too should be selected on a competency basis, not just because they happen to know the minister that guides the appointment. So that in effect ends self-regulation. So it's sort of a big step, and governments and professions are doing it slowly, but it is happening, and I'll talk about where it's happening in a second. The second trend is towards smaller boards. That effective boards, the literature suggests, are sort of between 7 and 12 people, and if you have 20 or 20 or 30 or 40, in my profession, Ontario, there's potentially 100 people that could attend a meeting of the governing council, and that just doesn't make sense. That's like a parliament. There's also a move that the people who are on the board should not serve on the statutory, on the regulatory committees like registration, complaints, discipline, quality assurance, whatever you call those committees. That it's a different skill set. You want on your board policy makers, strategic thinkers, people who can provide oversight to the organization, as opposed to committees where you need different kinds of skills, adjudication skills, skills related to knowledge about, entry to practice competencies. Plus, you don't have enough time to do both. If you're on the council and you're doing your job, you really don't have enough time to be working on committees as well. There's also been a move to say there's certain activities that probably should be done by somebody outside of the regulatory body themselves. And so in British Columbia, the legislation they introduced has established that the discipline committees for the health professions will not be part of the regulatory body. They will be run by a separate entity, and they'll be there for all of the health professions at least. Now, there still will be one person on the discipline committee from your profession, but it's not going to be run and operated by the council or board. And part of this is a skill, expertise, and part of it is, it's hard to adjudicate a case that someone else that you're going to sit on at the next council meeting referred to a hearing and say, okay, that should never have been referred to a hearing. And so it's part of a conflict of interest. The final part of governance is having a separate oversight body, which they have in the United Kingdom, and now exists in British Columbia already for your professions, and is going to occur for the health professions, already exists for financial professions, already exists for teachers. And so having an oversight body that monitors how the regulators are doing, gives them feedback, gives them guidance, and makes public reports on their performance. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about governance reform, and it's coming. Canada is the last sort of bastion of self-regulation in the Commonwealth world, and you just sense that it's a matter of time till it ends.
Interesting. We've certainly moved a little bit in that direction locally. So we have an act change that has just passed third reading at our legislature, and one of the elements in that act change was to separate appeals of disciplinary decisions to a separate committee that is different from, because right now it goes to our council, and our council is the one who reviews appeals of disciplinary decisions. And so we're creating a specialized board for that. So for anybody who didn't hear the news just of the last few days, our act change did go through third reading, so we expect it to be proclaimed very soon. It's interesting you mentioned too about entirely separating it to another organization. That's what happens in Quebec, is it not? They have something called the Steinecke that performs this separate disciplinary role. When I've talked to my counterparts in Quebec, they joke about they're in the same building, but they don't even have a key card that lets them into the floors where the Steinecke employees work, because it's physically and electronically separated as a body to review complaints against members. I've got a question here in the chat. Dave mentions that in the USA there is an industrial exemption for licensure of engineers. I wasn't personally aware of that. He asks, can you comment on the merits of the Canadian system versus the one in the USA? Richard, there's a lot of differences between professional regulation in Canada and the US. Any idea about this? Have you heard about this exemption, or can you speak to it in general terms?
Yeah, I'm not very knowledgeable about that. But I think the thought is that in certain industries, there are so many safeguards within the organization, the company itself, that you don't need an external regulator who will interfere with the company. And so, there are, I think, there are some small examples of that even in Canada. But I'm not sure that, I think there's some value in having an external regulatory body, even for a large company that's very specialized.
Yeah, I fully agree on that. It does bring up, though, another topic that's been emerging and has really caught the media's attention lately for us, which is title enforcement. Recently, Alberta took enforcement action against somebody using the term software engineer, and their legislation allows them to do so. In fact, sort of suggests that they must do so. But our title enforcement has been much different in Canada versus the US. Any thoughts on that? I'm not sure if you've heard any more about that story. Any thoughts on how engineers approach title enforcement and how that might differ from other professions?
Well, I think this is a common issue among professions. Of course, there's some titles that are more specialized and are unlikely to reach that kind of level of confusion. So, for example, I don't know, a physiotherapist. I mean, you don't see people calling them physiotherapists of, well, I guess you have animal physiotherapists. Even there you have some confusion. There was a case in BC where someone was calling themselves a death midwife, and their role was to assist people going through death, and the midwifery regulator there successfully prosecuted them for using that title, even though there was little risk of confusion. I think it boils down to risk of confusion. And so when you have a title like engineer, that's going to be a little bit more controversial because, engineering has a number of meanings, including, the person who drives a railway car. So I think you're going to be getting some pushback on that, and you're going to be having challenges like you're seeing in Alberta as to whether that is truly misleading the public. So that's what it boils down to: is it misleading the public? The other thing, though, is that if you don't enforce the title, then the title becomes meaningless. And so in Ontario, before, many decades ago, you couldn't use the term doctor unless you were a physician or an optometrist or a dentist. And because everyone was using doctor so often, and now there are many health professions in which you can use the title doctor so long as you qualify it. So you could say I'm a doctor of naturopathy. I think this is going to be sort of a battle between what's really there to protect the public, and is the title being used as a barrier for protecting the profession, and courts and legislatures are going to get into that.
Yeah, speaking of Alberta, there was a recent decision that came down. I know that it was discussed at another conference recently about costs of disciplinary decisions. And the appeal court in Alberta, did they suggest that the regulators should expect to bear all of the costs in most circumstances for disciplinary decisions? Can you speak to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating case, the Jinnah case. The approach before this case, generally across Canada, was when you discipline someone and find them guilty of professional misconduct, who should bear the cost of that prosecution? Should it be the individual, or should it be the profession as a whole? And generally, courts and even policymakers have said, well, if you're found to have engaged in professional misconduct, you should be bearing some of the costs most of the time. But there's been sort of an attempt to say, let's not make the cost so punitive that no one would ever defend themselves at a discipline case for fear of having to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars. So there was sort of a balanced approach. In Alberta, they said, okay, we understand that, but you know what? We think that that goes too far. It's still a disincentive to defending yourself. And we need to put some pressure on regulators to ensure that they only send cases disciplined that are really bad. And if there's another way, if there's a right touch regulation way of dealing with it short of discipline, we want to encourage regulators. And one way to do that is to say they have to bear their own costs most of the time. So in that case, they said, unless there was very serious misconduct, unless they are serial offenders, unless they've been disciplined, this is their second or third or more time being disciplined, generally the membership should bear the costs. I have no idea whether that is going to be spreading across Canada or not. I'm just waiting to see the next case in Ontario to see whether they review and reconsider their approach in light of the Alberta decision, because the Alberta Court of Appeal they had quite a long discussion of the issue. It wasn't like a one-liner.
Yeah, it was. I remember reading some highlights of that, and it was quite far-reaching, sort of saying this is our expectations for all professional regulators in the province, even though it was obviously specific to one case. I'm curious to see how that plays out, because the legislation, even in that instance, was pretty clear that some or all of the costs can be ordered against the individual. But it's understandable that some of those can get pretty high. I saw one case from Alberta for an engineering company that was ordered to pay in the range of $250,000 for costs after disciplinary hearing. So it can get quite large. I do have a question that came directly to me here on the chat. What are your thoughts on provincial registration and oversight versus having a national registration with local committees? We touched upon this a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I think if there is a national regulator, that there will have to be, local offices and much of the work being done locally. Yeah, I don't think you want to have a national regulator with their head office in, Ottawa or Vancouver or Montreal. I think that will definitely happen if there is a national regulatory body, which in fact, I don't think is really going to happen in my lifetime.
Yeah, thanks. And there was also a comment here from Christopher. There were issues a few years ago regarding Microsoft certified systems engineers. I do recall that. This is returning to the enforcement of title issue. And Quebec was successful in that instance in prosecuting against Microsoft, a major global firm. And they got a successful order that required them to not use that title, Microsoft certified systems engineers, anymore. And so now they've got a different term for it. I think they still use the MCSE abbreviation, but it doesn't have the word engineer anymore in that. So yes, thank you, Christopher, for raising that. Although things evolve, regulation evolves, and that was the case 20 years ago. We'll see if the public still wants us to enforce in that way. There's another word that we hear a lot in professional regulation these days with respect to transparency. We hear that a lot of an expectation that regulators be transparent. Can you talk to us about that idea and what that means?
Yeah, I think in our society, there's an expectation that public interest bodies will be very open about the information that they have. And so there's been a huge evolution in this. So take the example of council meetings. They used to be all private, and now there's a trend to ensure that council and board meetings are open to the public with very rare exceptions. And not only that they be open to the public, but that you publish the agenda and a copy of the materials that's before the council, and that the minutes of the council decisions be posted on the website. So that the public can see how and why decisions are made. Before the Charter of Rights, most discipline hearings were closed to the public. Since the Charter of Rights in the early 80s, discipline hearings have ordinarily been held in public, so the public can see why, how people are being disciplined and what the sanction is. I think the biggest growth in this area is in terms of the public register or registry, depending on which term you use, which has information about individuals. And so I think that there's a sense that that information about practitioners, not just whether they've been disciplined or not, but what would the public like to know about them. So you certainly want to know about referrals to discipline, but what about major complaints outcomes? Why shouldn't we know about that? And if there's an inspection, why shouldn't we know whether they passed the inspection or not? And if they're not complying with continuing professional development or paying their fees, why don't we know that? And if they've been charged or convicted of an offense, why don't we know that? And if they've been sued successfully for malpractice, why don't we know that? Why didn't you put that on the register? And if they've been registered in another jurisdiction or disciplined in another jurisdiction, why don't we know that? So there's a huge move to increasing access to the information about individual registrants, and not only putting it on the public register, but making it accessible. So it's easy to find on the website. You have a link from the home page. The language is easy to understand. And there's even a regulator in California that has an app that you could sign up for up to 16 physicians and find out anything that happens to those physicians. So there's quite a push in this area.
Yeah, it's interesting about the idea of the register. I saw somebody present recently on the idea of making sure that when people Google an engineer, are they getting our results? Are they getting to our register first before going to some sort of rate my engineer kind of website? It's a fascinating topic and something that we'll have to stay on top of. Richard, we've discussed a lot of different things, some very big topics, some things that I'm sure was new for our attendees today. I really want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today. We are going to wrap it up because we are at the end of the hour. Thank you again, Richard. I really appreciate you spending the time here today and for helping out at our Ingenium. Any final words before we say goodbye?
No, I just thank you for having me. And if you find this challenging, just think about, it's going to get worse if you don't think about it. If you don't talk about it, it's just going to get worse.
Great.
Thank you for watching. Visit the Ingenium On Demand library for more exclusive content.